Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's so great to see people in this theater. Oh, it's fantastic. I'm Carrie Weber. I'm the Frank and Clara Meditz Executive Director of the Fairfield University Art Museum. And I'm delighted that you are all here tonight to celebrate the opening of the exhibition 13 Ways of Looking at Landscape, Larry Silver's Connecticut Photographs. Yay! As you will soon see, this solo exhibition of Larry's work is his largest ever and includes over 80 landscape-based works made of and in Connecticut over the last 40 years. Before we get to tonight's talk with the exhibition's curator, Leslie K. Brown, I have a few quick announcements and a few thank yous to make. First and foremost, I would like to thank Larry and his wife Gloria for making this exhibition possible and for letting Dr. Brown into their home for days at a time. I want to thank Dr. Brown for curating this exhibition. She examined every one of the over 6,000 photographs in Larry Silver's archive from his 7-decade-long career. I hope you will enjoy her thoughtful presentation of the works she selected in the gallery and in her eloquent catalog essay. She presents Larry Silver's work in ways it has not been seen before. Additionally, I'm grateful to Bruce Silverstein and Bruce Silverstein Gallery in New York for their enthusiastic collaboration on this project. The digital paper for Larry's photographs is supplied by Red River Paper, and the beautiful printed image of sitting at water's edge on the exhibition title wall in the lobby was donated by B Digital LLC. At tonight's reception, please enjoy the desserts courtesy of Mike Salisbury and Isabelle Vincent, the wonderful traditional French bakery in downtown Fairfield. It's a lot. Wait till you see. I would like to thank the exceptional Fairfield University Art Museum team for their hard work in bringing this exhibition and its associated programming to life. Michelle DiMarzo, Curator of Education and Academic Engagement, Rosalinda Rodriguez, Museum Assistant, and Megan Pacwa, Museum Registrar. We hope you will come back for a wonderful program happening on April 20th in this same space. Silver will join his contemporary and fellow photographer, Adra Cowens, whose work is currently on view up the hill in the Museum's Bellarmine Hall galleries in a show curated by Halima Taha for a lively conversation between the two artists and the two curators. It should be a really fun night. Now, let me introduce our speaker for tonight, the guest curator of our exhibition, Leslie K. Brown. Dr. Brown is an independent curator, scholar, and educator who specializes in the history of photography and modern and contemporary art. She holds a PhD in the history of art and architecture from Boston University and an MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin. A former curator at the Photographic Resource Center in Boston, Brown has also worked as a museum educator at the Cheekwood Museum of Art and the Austin Museum of Art. In addition to dozens of exhibitions curated or coordinated at the PRC, she has also guest curated exhibitions for the DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum and the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. An award-winning educator, Brown has taught courses at colleges and universities across New England, including BU, College of the Holy Cross, Lesley University's College of Art and Design, Rhode Island School of Design, Simmons University, Wellesley College, and University of Massachusetts, Boston. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Leslie Brown to the stage.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone here, and it's great to see faces again. I feel like we're springing up just like the spring equinox. So I have a few thank yous myself as well. I'll start with Carrie Weber, the Executive Director of the Fairfield University Art Museum, who graciously invited me to curate this exhibition and who also hosted me several times at her own home. The wonderful museum staff here as well as the contract installers who I met last week, who are Level FAS and Nick Schifrin. Of course, my deepest gratitude goes to Larry Silver and Gloria, as well as Michael, who at my beck and call would take boxes down from a variety of different cabinets and open them and move things around when I was spending time, many, many days, many late nights at their home. I also would like to thank Bruce Silverstein Gallery, as well as Bruce Silverstein, Francis Jakubek, and Christina Zanetti, who work at the gallery. And as we joked often, also my Bruce. There's two Bruces here, Bruce Myron, my husband, my partner, who actually printed the wonderful image of the woman that you'll see on the title wall, as well as actually drove down the last time I was here because I got 2 flat tires. So it has been a long time in coming, about a year in total. And so it's finally here. So thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to start out a little bit more personally about myself because I think this intersection of myself and Larry, as well as the Fairfield University, is quite fortuitous. I am the product of a Kodak family. I'm from Rochester, New York, and I grew up around photography. My father, Gordon Brown, or Gordy as he is known to many in Kodak land, had a darkroom in his basement that I would help out at, and I would help to move what I called the hippo. It was the hypo. I went to college south of there. I also did an internship at the George Eastman Museum, which I was beyond delighted every single day to show up there. My previous scholarly projects actually intersect quite nicely with this. I do focus on landscape photography, but the seeds of this also can be seen in my project that I did for my master's thesis on the photo-secessionist Anne Brigman, who was a turn-of-the-century California photographer who photographed in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And I compared her work to that of a poet, thinker, writer, Edward Carpenter, whose poems are very much similar to Walt Whitman's. After working at the PRC, I went back to school to BU, and my dissertation dealt with Kodak picture spots, which are signs that are placed into the landscape to tell you this is a good place to take a picture. Think Disney, think World's Fairs, and the like. So this idea of landscape and looking and views and vistas has been something that's been running throughout my whole life. And I think particularly appropriate to have this exhibition here at Fairfield on such a gorgeous campus. It is my hope that I, together with Larry, allow you to see things in a different way after seeing the show, and I'll speak more about that later. So what this talk will be giving a little bit of history on Larry himself, and if I get anything wrong, Larry, please correct me later, and you can, of course, ask him more questions. I also will talk a little bit about important figures and exhibitions that parallel or cross throughout his life history. Other figures that I see as having synergy with Larry and his work, and I'll situate him within the history of American photography. Finally, I will conclude by giving a brief sort of virtual tour of the exhibition, and then you'll be invited not only for the reception, but then to go around the exhibition yourself. So let's get started. Okay, and I want to thank Larry and Gloria for sharing some of these wonderful pictures with me. They're just delightful. And some of you might have known Larry for this long, actually. So I wanted to sort of begin where we are, which is, in Fairfield, in the Westport area, because one of the things that I noticed when I started looking through Larry's work, and I really did want to look through all of his work as much as I possibly could of Connecticut. I saved the China and Iceland and other things for later. That there was a distinct sense of place that was woven throughout. There was also a sensitivity that I noticed that for me, again, had synergies with poetry and writing. And that's the thread that I wanted to pull on, and that's sort of the genesis of the exhibition. I started by looking at his website, and that's when the germs of these ideas sort of formed. So I didn't come in with a set idea other than my own background and interest in landscape. I took it from the works themselves. So starting here, I think it's also fortuitous that Larry and Gloria moved here to Westport, Connecticut in 1973 from New York, and that is the year that I was born. So I think it's something is working on all of us. So for him, when he moved from New York and moved out of the Bronx, which is where he was born, he talks about feeling a shift in perspective, and he started exploring his new regional environment with his camera. And he remarked earlier of this move from the city to the countryside as it opened my eyes, quote, to a whole new direction of photography, and the new images made me feel reborn, unquote. Speaking more recently, and this is in an interview in the catalog itself, I'll quote from it in part, Silver stated, "When we first arrived, it was a stunning transition. As we both had lived in New York City for most of our lives, frankly, we both felt we landed onto another planet, where our senses were flooded with new stimuli. It was early summer, and the flowers were blooming, and the wild berries had begun to ripen. It was like a dream. Over time, we got more involved with the community and the extraordinary art scene. Today, Westport is our home, and life before is a distant memory," unquote. And so that's kind of where we begin. And I wanted to show a different side to Larry Silver and his work. He is most associated with Photo League influenced photographers who were a collective of socially concerned photographers based in New York City primarily, who photographed on the street as well as with sort of a socially conscious bent. So for me, I saw what probably I hope that he saw, that he transitioned from photographing the streets of New York quite easily, I think, to the rolling hills, the beautiful stone walls of Connecticut, as well as its many beaches. At first, it doesn't seem like it fits, but I hope to show you that it actually really does. And as Carrie mentioned, bringing together over 40 years of Silver's photographs made in and of Connecticut. And I want to sort of consider how he pushes the boundaries of what landscape is and can be. Again, my process in brief was I just looked through every single box that I could. And we did make a decision early on that we would not look at 11 by 14s, just to sort of cut things down a little bit. And interestingly enough, so I cut it down from about 6,000, it's an estimate, to about 1,000, to 400, to 100, then 81, which you'll see in the show. From our determination, and the museum staff also helped to figure this out, we believe it actually might be the largest show of his work ever. We did check on a similar, a slightly smaller show at the Housatonic Museum of Art. And I also am showing, I hope, new work that you might not have seen, or also a side of Larry that you didn't know he had. So, okay, let's begin at the beginning. And I do want to point out that these are all here in their Westport home, and that is the small room here that I spent a lot of time in down here, as well as actually at their dining room table. Many, many hours and wonderful conversations. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Larry was born in the Bronx in 1934. He was drawn to photography very, very early on. And as the New York Historical Society explained as a part of an exhibition of his New York work, that his mother bought him a Brownie camera, and he ended up turning his bedroom into a dark room and taking over the apartment's only bathroom sink wholeheartedly. As you can see here, Larry attended the High School of Industrial Art, or which is colloquially known as SIA. And here also you can see Larry shared with me this wonderful photograph actually from his high school yearbook. And I want to point out, even though he's actually here in Manhattan at this time, that's where the school was, this is an interesting blend of both the city and nature, as you can see here in this wonderful picture of a leaf. This is his yearbook from 1953. So the seeds of this, I would like to suggest, were formed very, very early on. I'll speak a little bit more about his later schooling in a little bit, but let's spend some time in New York first. Okay. I'm sort of now trying to chart out sort of the milieu into which Larry was exposed. And being in high school at this time, imagine him going to what was known as the Peerless Camera Store, which is now later merged with what is known as Willoughby's and is still in existence today. And I know this too because as a daughter of a photographer, there is a lot of talk that happens in a camera store and meeting so many different people at that juncture. It was around this time that Larry got introduced, again as a teenager, to a group that was formed in the 1930s called the Photo League. And the Photo League itself was a cooperative sort of generated group of similar interests of amateur as well as professional photographers. There were also both still and film. They sort of had two wings to them. And some of the photographers that were a part of the Photo League as well as leading it that you might have heard of include Sid Grossman and Sid Libson. They founded it in 1936. And many of the original members of the Photo League were actually first-generation Americans, children of immigrants that came together and found community in the areas of Manhattan's Lower East Side, as well as Brooklyn or in the Bronx. A lot of the photographers came from working-class families as well. And this is into this amazing scene. Larry started hanging out with them. They initially operated out of a loft on East 21st Street. They also offered low-cost darkrooms, lectures by a lot of famous photographers, as well as courses in photographic history, a little bit of everything. And had they not actually been deemed a subversive organization in 1947, they might have been one of the earliest sort of very photocentric schools. Now, you might be wondering why that was the case. Well, they, generally speaking, the group espoused and dabbled in a lot of progressive as well as socially bent causes. And unfortunately, with some things happening around at that time and the Red Scare, that is what ended up sort of bringing it onto the Photo League. What I'm showing you here are actually photographs of someone who is around the same time period, as you can see, from 1947 to 49. These are photographs by Harold Feinstein, who passed away in 2015, but he also had some connections to where I live now, which is in Massachusetts. And on his blog, he found several rolls, I believe, of Photo League meetings and exhibitions that he posted and invited people to help identify some of the people that he didn't quite remember. So it's still up there. He has an estate, his trust still operates, so if you know of any more, including Larry, do let them know. Some people that you might see here, are actually Lou Perella, who was editor of US Camera, Dan Weiner, a photo instructor in the Air Force, who later did commercial work for Fortune and Look magazine, and Jacob Deschen, the camera editor for the New York Times, as well as a writer. And as you can see here, too, it's an incredibly diverse crowd. Here, they're having lectures, or they're attending an exhibition, and showing something perhaps even as a part of a group crit. I want to turn now to a few photographers that were associated with the Photo League that Larry particularly has singled out. And the first one is Lou. They're both named Lou, Lewis Bernstein. He grew up on the Lower East Side. He was the oldest son of Jewish immigrants from Romania. And he joined the Brooklyn Camera Club and then later became a Photo League member and remained until it closed in 1951. And I do want to say something about the layout of these slides that I'm going to be showing you as I sort of proceed throughout photo history. I am going to be talking about a few other photographers that I feel have synergy with Larry and his work. But to differentiate and not to forget that we're talking about Larry Silver, I am including a photograph of his within each slide. And as you can see, it's the one that has the white key line around it, so you'll be able to identify it. So what's quite interesting is Bernstein also, he actually worked at Peerless Camera Store, and he also met hundreds of people and many famous photographers through working there, including Edward Steichen, W. Gene Smith, and Ernest Haas. And he also offered private classes himself, as eventually he also taught at Cooper Union. This is a quote by him that he wrote later on in 1969. For me, it actually resonates a lot with Larry's work. Quote, "I believe that every photograph is a statement by the person taking the picture about how he feels and sees the world and himself. My own photographs are a kind of story of my deepest feelings and how they have changed over the years," unquote. And I picked this image here from him because also this idea of sort of looking, and I just love this image of this woman on a bench with something over her face and the glasses on top of that. Okay. Another photographer, another important figure in Larry Silver's life is Lewis Stetner. And Stetner was a really interesting figure who was mostly self-taught. He went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and just studied and worked his way through the collection. He also started working his way through the Journal of the Photo Secession camera work. He also visited Alfred Stieglitz's place, American Place, and there he met Paul Strand as well. And it was at the Photo League, actually, that Stetner took his first and really only classes in photography. He later went on to enlist, like many of the photographers did of this time. And then after the war, he actually received a commission from the Photo League to gather prints from French photographers who were quite important at the time, including people like Robert Doisneau and Bresson. And this kind of cross-ocean connection is something that's similar that you'll see in the Photo League as well as other photographers I'm going to talk about. Sort of this connections and sort of filtering back and forth. So he, like the other Lou, also developed a lot of friendships and connections. A lot of people, when he was in Paris, came to visit him, including Eugene Smith as well as Robert Frank. Now, Stetner returned to New York in the early 50s and started working as a freelance photographer as well as a commercial photographer. And he started having work as a part of advertising firms, which Larry did as well. I want to now sort of take the temperature of what Larry was doing around this time, and I'm showing you examples of his New York work. Now, imagine Larry Silver on the streets of New York or walking around in Central Park, age 15 to 17, with his camera, taking these images and surrounded by some of the greatest photographers that I mentioned here, hanging out at the Peerless Camera Store, spending time in the Photo League's headquarters as well. Some other photographers who were associated with the Photo League include Arthur Leipzig, Aaron Siskin, Lisette Modell. I mean, this is just a litany of who's who in early 20th century photography. Margaret Burke White, Helen Levitt, Arthur Rothstein, Nancy Newhall, Beaumont Newhall, Minor White, Richard Avedon, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston. Okay, so as you can see, it's not just photographers that gathered around this, but also writers, curators, and thinkers. And I'll let Harold Feinstein sort of set the scene further and cement this for you. When Harold was going to some of these meetings, he was around 18. Quote, "What I certainly do remember was how exciting it was to attend bi-weekly meetings where famous and unknown photographers from around the country and the world gathered to share their images and their ideas. The speaker at my first meeting was the legendary Paul Strand, one of the key people credited for really establishing photography as a legitimate art form. Rubbing shoulders with fellow photographers headed in a kindred direction and caught up in the debates and discussions within the group was almost as stimulating as the photography. So from New York, after graduating from high school, Larry entered a contest, actually, which was the 26th Annual Scholastic Ansco Photography Award, and he won. He won a full scholarship to the Art Center School in Los Angeles, California, in 1953. So off he went from one coast to the other. And just as you can see here, I also wanted to note that both of these schools have slightly different names today. And he attended the Art Center from 1953 until 1956. And these are some images that I pulled from their archive. They have a very extensive archive, which is quite wonderful. And I'm also really interested in the history of art education, personally, as well as art institutions. And I love this image of one of the founder here talking to all these students sort of gathered around. I'm sure Larry could also tell some stories from this time. So while he was on the West Coast, Larry did one of his most famous series that still has a lot of traction today, and that is Muscle Beach. This basically, starting in 1934, not Larry, but this was a place where a lot of people gathered to show off fitness. In many ways, some people credit it as the birthplace of the physical fitness boom, or at least that one of the early 20th century. And it started primarily with gymnastic-style activities on the south side of Santa Monica Pier. Now, the beach itself dates back to the 30s and associated with the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, installed actually exercise equipment in the area. So it wasn't just a beach with a boardwalk, it actually had parts of the built environment that a lot of people ended up using. And there was also a platform on the beach, which a lot of really famous or aspiring bodybuilders also went up and tried to show off. And this was the subject of a very important exhibition of this work at the International Center of Photography in 1984. And for comparison, I'm showing you on the right an image by Ouija, who is associated with the Photo League as well. And this is a great image of a lot of people on the Coney Island beach. Okay. I want to turn now to a few sort of touchstone flagship exhibitions. I'm not trying to say that our exhibition is in any way as illustrious as some of the ones I'll show you here, but as someone who's a curator who's also interested in the history of exhibition of photography, I was particularly struck when I started looking for these images. I was aware of Ouija's exhibition at the Photo League in 1941. I knew it was different. You can see it at the upper left. He's showing all these images, and it's sort of chock-a-block full, almost mimicking the layout of a newspaper, which is where his images ran, mostly tabloids. You can see it says murder, and that was called Murder Is My Business. That's at the Photo League there. But when I tried to find one a little later, this is an exhibition that was done at the Photo League in 1948, and it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. I knew that later on in the mid-50s, with the family of man, there would be an interesting explosion, if you will, of how photographs were installed. But here, as you can see here, I found this actually after driving back from here, from laying out the show, that what you see here, and I hope you'll see the synergy, I didn't know it at the time, we see all these clusters. And that's how this exhibition is sort of hung. So I just love that these, again, fortuitous overlaps that are happening here. Now, in terms of, again, the FBI around this time emphasizes emphasized the group's commitment to social causes, and they then alleged that there were dissident activities with this. This exhibition in 1948 was done soon after they were dubbed that, and in many ways it was a response to it. It was called This Is the Photo League, and it was held at their new headquarters on East 10th Street. And as you can see here, I also love how they get chairs are part of the exhibition, and also these really fascinating I'm not exactly sure what these are, strings, almost acting as a scrim between parts of the exhibition space itself. Now, another exhibition that I feel like is important to talk about, because it also speaks to the human side of Larry's photography, is The Family of Man, which is a really important exhibition done in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art. And it was curated by Edward Steichen, who is the second photo curator at MoMA after Beaumont Newhall. And he was photo curator at MoMA from 1947 to 1962. Like Larry, he also had a background as well in commercial photography. I like to say to my students that Steichen had about just 9 different lives. He was associated with the Photo Secession and Alfred Stieglitz. He also was responsible for bringing a lot of European photographers and even European artists to New York City to be shown for the very first time. In many ways, this is because he also had a tie to Europe himself. He was born in Luxembourg. And this sort of cross-connection across the ocean was very important to bring modernist ideas. It's not to say they weren't already here in the US, but it does have a little bit of a lag. The title of the exhibition actually is from a speech by Abraham Lincoln. Actually, I realized I just accidentally went ahead, so I'll go back. And it was called The Family of Man, and it emphasized the commonalities between all people from all across the world. In many ways, this is a product of the Cold War, and it is actually deemed, and I'm pretty sure that it is, the most seen photography exhibition ever. There were 503 photographs by 273 photographers from 69 countries. And it traveled in several versions for almost a decade to 38 countries. And it's estimated 9 million people saw it. And if you actually also include the people who bought or looked through the catalog, which is still in print, by the way, it's many tens of millions more. So another thing, so let's go ahead and move on here to where I was supposed to be. And another photographer that Larry has cited as someone who's really important in his work and how he conceives of photography as well as looks at the world is W. Gene Smith. As Silver noted actually in our interview, quote, W. Gene Smith had a sensitivity to his subjects while also expressing who he was, and was an exacting printer. Just as a writer or poet wishes to express themselves directly, I believe that making the print myself is just as important and equally an art as snapping the shutter. And as you can see here, I'm showing you 2 pieces by Smith. The top is what he's most known for, and that is the picture essay or the photo essay. He's widely credited as the father, as sort of the first photo essay, which is this one in particular, actually, from 1948. And he worked for Life magazine from 1946 to 54. Over 8 years that he worked there, he authored about 50 different photo essays. What is a photo essay? It's a combination of usually large, multiple images with text, extensive text that goes over several pages. And in many ways, this was also something that Edward Steichen drew upon for his inspiration here. Because as you can see, the actual layout of the exhibition in many ways looks like a page from Life magazine exploded into the walls of MoMA itself. Oftentimes, Smith would focus on one place or one person to follow through with his story. And also, one of the things that he's most known for is a really important photograph that you see in the lower right that was featured in The Family of Man. It was actually later on in the exhibition, and the exhibition had a very distinct method of an order to it, which in many ways this exhibition you'll see shortly does as well. This was towards the end, after moving through the exhibition, not only seeing different types of families, joy, sorrow, war, as well as actually a projected version of an atomic bomb test. Then they kind of come back to the fore with children, and as well as images of surf and waves crashing, so almost acting as a baptism as everyone ends the exhibition and goes back out into their real world, to the real life. This walk through Paradise Garden is one of Smith's most well-known images, and as you can see here, it's sort of standing in almost sort of a Adam and Eve type figure, or emerging from something, the trauma of World War II, the Cold War, et cetera, to hopefully better times and new ideas with the generation ahead. So from dark to light, and from that sort of sorrow to hope. Okay, and as you can see here, I'm pairing it with this image, which is one of my favorites, by Larry here, Three Kids in the Dock, that he did soon after they moved to Connecticut. Another photographer that Silver is also cited is widely known as the father of modern photojournalism. And this is Henri Cartier-Bresson, and he was someone who created something. He actually put a name to something. It was called The Decisive Moment, and that was the name of one of his books as well that you can see here from 1952. I'll quote from it. "To take a photograph means to recognize simultaneously, within a fraction of a second, both the fact itself and the rigorous organization of the visually perceived forms that give it meaning." He called this he called this a visual trap, that the photographer, often bearing the very new Leica 35mm camera, would sort of lay in wait for a heightened formal moment or a heightened emotional happening of some sort, and then snap the shutter. And in many ways, he argued that all of those things would then be felt by the viewer when they then looked at the resulting image. And as you can see, this is what I love, this synergy between one of Larry's more famous and celebrated works, Dancing on the Jetty in Westport, in terms of capturing this decisive moment. So moving a little bit along, I would like to turn a little bit now to Cerkowski. And another photographer that Larry has talked about extensively, and someone who I actually feel personally, we'll have to argue whether or not Larry feels the same way. I feel perhaps they're the most simpatico. Andrei Cerkowski was born in Hungary. There's a saying from the time that if you have humor and human, again, this sort of humanitarian social bent combined, it equals Hungarian. And he spent a lot of time roaming around various cities with his Leica. Like Cartier-Bresson, he has a very snapshot-like aesthetic. But one of the things that I notice here too, and maybe you do as well, is that Cerkowski often saw a lot of forms in light and shadow, as well as things that were photographed in various types of weather or fog. And as you'll see here, and actually it's appropriate day, it's almost like everyone entered into a Larry Silver photograph when we came here with this sort of fogginess outside. You see this repetition of pattern happening again and again within Cerkowski's work, and it's a blend of humanism abstraction, as well as, again, there's a real poetic quality, I think, to Cerkowski's work in principle, basically. He was very influential on a lot of street photographers. He also did a lot of commercial work as well and was published primarily in magazines. One other thing before moving on from Bresson I want to point out is, again, an emphasis both with Cerkowski as well as Bresson on printing. The darkroom is incredibly important to them, as well as Larry Silver, who had a darkroom for decades. And as Larry Silver explained, he said, "It was from Bresson that I learned how important it was to frame using the lens, as well as the camera, before snapping the shutter, as opposed to cropping later in the darkroom. Like Bresson, many of the early works were printed so that one could see the negative holder surrounding the printed image, like a black frame. By showing the outline of the negative holder, I reinforced the fact that the work was not edited in the darkroom." So I'd like to show a few more, if you will, bear with me, in terms of some ways of thinking about Larry Silver's work, and then I will take you on a very short tour of the exhibition, and then I will release you. Following Steichen, the next curator at MoMA was John Cerkowski, who also had a very long tenure and a very long shadow. And he was very much a formalist. And he curated an exhibition that you see here of American photography since 1960. And he proposed two ways of thinking about the major trends that he saw in photography at the time. And they are mirrors and windows. In brief, mirrors are something about looking into oneself. And generally speaking, you cannot date the photograph. Sometimes it will be something very dark or a very close-up image, narrower angle of view, very much tied to our feelings and empathy and expression. Sometimes you can't even put a finger on how it makes you feel, but it's meant to make you feel nonetheless. On the other pole, he proposed windows, and that's exactly what it sounds like, the idea that you could look through a window out into the outside world, very much more based in exploration and observation. Generally speaking, the windows images are lighter, and they are more about explaining things. You can also date them often with a specific time and place. And this is something that a lot of people realized at the time, and I kind of see sometimes Larry Silver vacillating between these two poles. Sometimes you'll see, as you see here, very close-up images, abstracted images, and I'm comparing here one of Larry's works, beautiful piece, 40 by 50 inch of water, to both Aaron Siskind and Paul Caponegro. And also, he sometimes verges into the windows as well, and I'm bringing in for your consideration Lee Friedlander, who did a lot with framing, just like Larry does, as well as Joel Meyerowitz, who was a real pioneer in color photography within the fine art world. And I just love how these all work together with one of the very late images, one of the newest images in the exhibition itself, of Larry's sort of sitting himself down in front of this sort of aperture and waiting for people to sort of pass by, sort of a different kind of decisive moment that to me becomes a much more poetic, much more painterly. A few more, and then we'll turn to our exhibition at hand. One of the points that I make in the exhibition essay, and also as you'll see, there's several of the themes that touch upon this, is the idea of the social landscape. And that's a combination not only of people but place within the built environment. It is a site of interaction, and as we know, even natural scenes aren't actually totally natural and are never exactly neutral. And this sort of nexus, which Nathan Lyons, who was the curator of this exhibition towards the social landscape, said that nexus between man and nature, which I see is very prevalent within Larry's work, focusing both on simple yet complex relationships of people to their natural environments. Another exhibition that I see resonating with this is New Documents, an exhibition up here in the upper right, curated by Cerkowski. As you can see, Friedlander shows up again, as well as Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus. I will say, though, in terms of bringing it sort of a little bit further into the 1970s, new topographics is something that I do see some strains coming into Larry's work, but this exhibition was very much more about being very neutral with almost a deadpan style work. But this idea of bringing together various photographers to take the temperature of what is happening at that time is really what I'm trying to emphasize with bringing these three exhibitions to the fore. So now I just want to introduce you a little bit further to the exhibition. I was inspired by this poem for this exhibition because after looking through Larry's work, things sort of started to fall into categories in the different ways in which he looked at the landscape and strategies that he utilized to form his compositions. And I started Googling. I wondered if there was actually a poet from Connecticut that might have some sort of synergy. And indeed there is, and that is Wallace Stevens, who is one of the most known modern poets who lived and called Hartford, Connecticut his home for almost 4 decades. And I don't mean to say, as you can see, there are 13 different stanzas that, number 1 here corresponds to number 1 in the gallery. I'm simply using it as sort of a structure, as a metaphor, and I'm gathering together Larry's individual works, much like stanzas of a poem. It's my goal that you sort of flow throughout it. Sometimes there's a work that actually could be in the prior one that I have at the beginning of the next sort of thematic cluster. So these ideas allowed me to bring together many different kinds of scapes, landscapes, waterscapes, cityscapes, etc. And this idea is something that permeates throughout the exhibition. This is an artist that I found that sort of brings to the fore the idea that there are literally 13 different ways of looking at a blackbird in Wallace Stevens' poem. And I'm bringing also in a quote by Robert Frank, who once famously stated, "When people look at my pictures, I want them to feel the way they do when they want to read a line of a poem twice," unquote. And that's the same thing that I would like you to do with Larry Silver's work, is to sort of spend a longer time than you might otherwise, not only with the clusters, but with the individual images. So turning now, I'm just wrapping up here. I'm going to give you a little bit orientation before we move on to the celebration. As you can see here, these are the different clusters of the works, and it was my goal to sort of break out of the traditional double hanging, linear hanging that you saw, for example, here, up this Cerkowski. This is a very mid-century, later 20th century type of hanging. I wanted to do something different. It's a very large space, 20-foot ceilings, and there are a lot of large prints that Larry has as well, and I wanted to punctuate them throughout. So as you can see here, we move from actually sort of inviting you into the landscape with sort of a viewer by proxy. You'll see in the first theme that there are people that you are being invited to look at the vista through them. This is utilizing a compositional strategy that often was used in 19th century German romantic painting called a Rückenfigur. And then we move on from that to light and shadow and dark, atmosphere and weather, and here, as you can see here, abstraction as well as close-up. And then the built environment, and this is sort of towards the social landscape section here, both people in the landscape as well as pattern. And then we round the corner, so you can see here what I'm talking about. Oh, one little note here, by the way, these viewers, which do look like people, are made in Norwalk, Connecticut, very, very close here, by the same family that has made them since 1932. So we move on through here. And again, it was my goal as much as possible to sort of break out of the typical hanging and the typical box. Then we move around and down this small hallway to ideas of line and linearity, as well as shapes and forms. And then from that, motion. Here, as you kind of see here, both things that are in motion, or sometimes actually a couple of these are Larry actually taking pictures from a moving car. Larry also utilizes and plays a lot with different things of foreground, middle ground, background, and different visual planes. This grouping is another large one that I hope maybe some of you have never seen this type of darkroom experimental work from Larry before. I do want to say that this is all created with black and white chemistry, so any color that you see there is what he's doing in the magic darkroom. He's actually even crumpling up the prints as well as walking upon them. And then I conclude the whole exhibition right across from where we started. We began with looking and we end with framing and sort of the use of what he does oftentimes of aperture and creating or seeing different types of framing techniques within the nature itself or within an urban environment. And so for me, this is really one of my favorite pieces. I know it's one of Larry's as well. And this is inviting you to then go forth into your environment, out into the landscape, to hopefully see it in a new and different way. I do want to say that please pick up one of the catalogs. It's absolutely stunning and beautiful. Thank you to the museum for that. You can also access it online here at this web link here. And then I'll end right there with you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Anyone have a question?
If you have a question, please go to the microphones that are in the aisles. This way, all of those people who are joining us live on the internet will also be able to hear.
I'd like to say you really nailed me.
I'm glad. I'm very glad. I hope so. You didn't know that about yourself. That's the best thing to hear as a curator.
Started to pick almost all the pictures you said, with the exception of 1 3. I have never interfered. I let you pick what you want.
Yes.
And I had a lot of doubts as to some of the images that you picked, because I had a lot of favorites that you didn't pick. But as you were explaining it, I realized how you saw it. And thank you for enlightening me, because you did.
Thank you.
Photographers are artists tend to pick out certain things that they like the most. And so they show that over and over again. And you came up with things that I didn't even want to see. Boxes that I didn't see in 10 years. I didn't open those boxes. But thanks again.
Thank you, Larry, so much. And thank you, Gloria, for inviting me into your house and your heart.
All right, well, if there's no questions, we will let you all go enjoy the exhibition and the reception.
As well as Larry himself, who gets to spend time now. Thank you.
Adger's got a question.
To ask you, how much did motion pictures influence you in your compositions? How much did motion pictures influence you in your compositions? Motion
Did
pictures, yeah,
motion
movies,
pictures-
movies.
They
or-
never influenced me. I just see things in single pictures, motion pictures are basically a lot of single pictures side by side. But I see, when I look, I see a single image. And so I don't think there is much influence there from the motion picture industry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Thank you.